Hello students, welcome to module 3 of the course on creative writing. In this video, we shall discuss identifying varieties of poetry. First, let's try to understand what defines the diversity in poetic forms. Although so far we have been talking about the poem as if it is a consistent monolithic entity, poetry has large varieties of form. Throughout its long history, poets have evolved different poetic forms, which have acquired popularity in a certain age and given way to newer forms in others or undergone modifications over time. In this video, we shall discuss some of the well-known poetic forms. The first form that we are going to discuss is narrative poetry. Narrative poetry is any poem that narrates a story or incident. We begin with narrative poetry because this happens to be one of the oldest forms of poetry to be developed by mankind. Pre-literate cultures often used poetry to pass down stories and cultural beliefs orally. One such important poetic form is the epic, also known as the heroic poem. Epic traditions have existed in numerous cultures across the world, and they display much variety, which makes it difficult to come up with one satisfactory and conclusive definition of the form. The Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia is the oldest known example of this form.
In literature, an epic is a long narrative poem that celebrates heroic achievements and themes of cultural significance. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia is the world's first recorded epic poem. Epics were written to commemorate the struggles and adventures of kings and warriors. Literary epics have large casts of characters but revolve around the achievements of a central hero. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was composed over 4,000 years ago, tells the story of the life of an Assyrian king, Gilgamesh. The story is loosely based on a historical king named Gilgamesh, who ruled the city of Uruk in modern-day Iraq sometime between 2800 and 2500 BCE. Gilgamesh's name appears in the Sumerian list of kings, compiled around 2000 BCE, and for at least 1,000 years after his death, poems were written about Gilgamesh in various languages. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a compilation of tales that were passed down orally and finally written down approximately 700 to 1,000 years after the historical king's death. Sometime between 1300 and 1000 BCE, a scribe named Sinleki Onini collected and edited the stories and created a unified literary work in Akkadian, which was the main Semitic language of ancient Mesopotamia. This composition is what scholars call the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Other epics include Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, Theogony by Hesiod, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Old English Beowulf, Metamorphoses by Ovid, Kumar Sambhava by Kalidas, Borzunama from the medieval Persia, Khambathoibi from medieval Manipur, and so on. Epics have also been written in more modern times, such as Milton, a Poem by William Blake, Don Juan by Lord Byron, The Prelude by William Wordsworth, Song of Myself by Walt Whitman, The Wanderings of Oisin by William Butler Yeats, The Fall of Arthur by J.R.R. Tolkien, Omeros by Derek Walcott, and Empire of Dreams by Jinania Barshi. Apocalypse by Frederick Turner is also another example. Various epic traditions, as you can see, have existed across cultures and over time. However, all or most of the following features can be observed across epic poems. First of all, it follows the adventures of a hero or demigod of outstanding national, cultural, or legendary importance. Second, it has divine or supernatural beings interfering in human affairs. A formal, elevated, and serious style of writing is also another characteristic of the epic. It begins in the middle or in medias res, and it describes battles of great importance and endorses military virtues of honor and valor. The seriousness of the epic style has also led to lampooning and criticism in later times. Thus, we have the convention of writing mock epics, which are narratives imitating most features of the epic but treat a trivial subject matter or set of characters with the intention of satirizing them. Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock and John Dryden's Macflecknoe are examples. Now let's discuss another type of narrative poetry, which is the romance or medieval romance. It is also known as chivalric romance, and it flourished in medieval and early modern Europe and often narrated fantastic tales of an extraordinary knight-errant on a journey of adventure and romance. Originally written in verse, later on they came to be written in prose as well. Unlike the heroic poems, which represented a heroic age of tribal wars, the chivalric romance presented a courtly and chivalric age. Medieval chivalric romance narratives are generally divided into 4 groups or cycles. The Matter of Britain, which includes Celtic tales of King Arthur and the Knight of the Round Table. The Matter of Rome, concerning tales of Alexander the Great and the Battle of Troy. Matter of England, with tales about heroes such as Guy of Warwick and King Horn. And the Matter of France, concerned with tales of Charlemagne. Examples of the chivalric romance in verse are Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Spenser's Faerie Queene, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Christabel, John Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes, and The Defense of Guinevere by William Morris. The next type of narrative poem that we are going to discuss is the ballad. The traditional ballad is a folk poem which tells a story and is meant to be sung. The traditional ballads were oral in nature and originated in pre-literate societies. F.B. Gamer describes the ballad as, I quote, a poem meant for singing, quite impersonal in material, probably connected in its origins with the communal dance, but submitted to a process of oral tradition among people who are free from literary influences and fairly homogeneous in character, unquote. Although this definition is mainly based upon the characteristics of the European ballad, folk story songs found around the world do possess similar traits with some variation. The content usually concerns a dramatic episode in the domestic affairs of ordinary folk rather than nobility. Love and valor form important elements, with supernatural elements making an appearance. Sir Patrick Spens, for example, is a popular Scottish ballad. Another example is the ballad of Pemi Chewang Tashi, which is a lose from Bhutan. In Assam, a set of popular folk ballads recount the horrors and sufferings of the times during the Burmese invasion. Ballads often make use of a stanza form called the ballad stanza, which is a quatrain rhyming ABCB, with the first and third lines carrying 4 accented syllables and the second and fourth carrying 3.
Poetry. Ballads. Most people think a ballad is a slow, sentimental love song. But a ballad is actually any poem or song that tells a story in short stanzas. These stories often recount romantic, comedic, heroic, or even tragic events. Like any narrative, a ballad typically has a beginning, middle, and end. Each verse or stanza of the poem usually has 4 lines, each with a song-like rhythm. Often the rhyming pattern is in the form A, B, C, B, which adds to the musical quality. Sometimes these poems can be set to music. Many of today's love songs are considered examples of ballads. Because some ballads have been set to music, they often contain a refrain, or a repeated chorus, just like a song. In summary, a ballad is a type of poem that tells a story. It uses a series of verses, usually with 4 lines each. The lines have a song-like rhythm, and the rhyming pattern used is of the form A, B, C, B.
There is great variation in the number of unstressed syllables. The rhyme is also often approximate, with frequent assonance and consonants. The folk ballad also inspired the writing of literary ballads. which are verse narratives written in imitation of the form and style of the former. Wordsworth and Coleridge call their collection of poems the lyrical ballads. Coleridge's Ancient Mariner is one of the ballads published in the volume. Another example of the literary ballad is La Belle Dame sans Merci by John Keats. Let's discuss another type of poetry, which is the lyric poetry. The lyric poetry is today understood as a brief subjective poem marked by imagination, melody, and emotion. Unlike the narrative poems that we just discussed, lyrics are non-narrative. They capture a single intense moment of emotion or a series of such emotions. They are usually written in the first person, suggesting a directness of expression. The genealogy of the term lyric leads to the stringed instrument lyre, for in the past, lyrics were songs sung to the accompaniment of a lyre, hinting at its essential musical quality. In the modern era, the lyric has become the most popular form of composing poetry and retains its musical aspect through the ingenious use of meter and rhyme, although it is not necessarily performed with music anymore. Today, it is a personal poem, and it covers the entire range from the sonnets of Shakespeare to the interior meditations of T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, and Seamus Heaney. When a lyric is melancholy or mournfully contemplative, especially when it laments a death, it may be called an elegy. Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is a classic example of the lyric poem. Now let's discuss the ode and elegy with a little more detail. The ode and elegy are subtypes of the lyric poem. The ode is a long lyric poem which is dignified and sincere in tone, directed to a single purpose and dealing with one theme. The ode was developed by the Greek poet Pindar, who based it on the choral songs in Greek drama, which were divided into three parts: the strophe, antistrophe, and epode. In English poetry, there are three types of odes: the Pindaric or regular, the Horatian or homostrophic, and the irregular type of ode. The Pindaric or regular ode is based upon the style followed by Pindar. It follows the three-strophe division, with the strophe and the antistrophe alike in stanza pattern and the epode different from the two. The epode may appear at the end or between the strophe and the antistrophe. The Horatian ode uses only one stanza type, and the irregular ode type, which was developed by Abraham Cowley, has each stanza in its own pattern of varying line lengths, number of lines, and rhyme scheme. This third type of the ode has been the most popular among later English poets. Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats and Ode to the West Wind by P.B. Shelley are examples of this form. The elegy is a formal poem expressing the poet's lamentation or meditation upon a death or any other solemn theme. The poem was inspired by elegies from classical Greece, which were any poem written using the elegic meter, which contains alternating hexameter and pentameter lines. By the 17th century, the term came to signify a poem of lamentation. Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam, which was written on the death of Arthur Hallam, and W.H. Auden's In Memory of William Butler Yeats are famous examples. Next, let us discuss the sonnet. The sonnet originated in the poetry composed at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the Sicilian city of Palermo. The 13th century poet and notary Giacomo da Lentini is credited with the sonnet's invention, and the Sicilian school of poets who surrounded him then spread the form to the mainland. The term sonnet is derived from the Italian word sonetto, which literally means a little song, and it is derived from the Latin word sonus, meaning a sound. Literally a little song, the sonnet traditionally reflects upon a single sentiment, with a clarification or turn of thought in its concluding lines. By the 13th century, it signified a poem of 14 lines that followed a strict rhyme scheme and structure. It was brought to England by Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, in the 16th century. Two sonnet forms provide the models from which all other sonnets are formed, the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean. The first and most common sonnet is the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. Named after one of its greatest practitioners, the Italian poet Petrarch, the Petrarchan sonnet is divided into two stanzas. The octave, which is the first 8 lines, followed by the answering sestet, the final 6 lines. It has a tightly woven rhyme scheme, ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE, or CDC, DCD. Since the Petrarchan sonnet presents an argument, observation, question, or some other answerable charge in the octave, a turn or volta occurs between the 8th and the 9th lines. This turn makes a shift in the direction of the foregoing argument or narrative, turning the sestet into the vehicle for the counter-argument, clarification, or whatever answer the octave demands. Sir Thomas Wyatt introduced the Petrarchan sonnet to England in the early 16th century. His famed translations of Petrarch's sonnets, as well as his own sonnets, drew fast attention to the form. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a contemporary of Wyatt's, whose own translations of Petrarch are considered more faithful to the original, though less fine to the ear, modified the Petrarchan, thus establishing the structure that became known as the Shakespearean sonnet. This is the second major type of sonnet, the Shakespearean, also called the English sonnet, and it follows a different set of rules. Here 3 quatrains and a couplet follow this rhyme scheme, ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG. The couplet plays a pivotal role, usually arriving in the form of a conclusion, amplification, or even refutation of the previous 3 stanzas, often creating an epiphanic quality to the end. For example, in Sonnet 130 of William Shakespeare's sonnet cycle, the first 12 lines compare the speaker's mistress unfavorably with nature's beauties, but the concluding couplet swerves in a surprising direction. Now let us discuss what is a sonnet cycle. A sonnet cycle, also called a sonnet sequence, is a group of sonnets arranged to address a particular person or theme and designed to be read both as a collection of fully realized individual poems and as a single poetic work comprising all the individual sonnets. A sonnet cycle may have any theme, but unrequited love is the most common. The arrangement of the sonnets generally reflects thematic concerns, with chronological arrangements, which could be linear like a progression or cyclical like the seasons, being the most common. A sonnet cycle may also have allegorical or argumentative structures which replace or complement chronology. Notable sonnet cycles have been written by Dante, Petrarch, Pierre de Ronsard, Edmund Spenser, Rupert Brooke, Sir Philip Sidney, William Shakespeare, John Donne, William Wordsworth, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Rainer Maria Rilke, among others. Let's look at some examples of sonnet cycles along with their authors. The first is Astrophel and Stella by Philip Sidney. This was published in 1591. Next is Sonnets, first published in 1609 by William Shakespeare. Sonnets from the Portuguese from 1850 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Modern Love by George Meredith, published 1862. House of Life by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, published 1881. 1914 by Rupert Brooke, published in 1915. And Sonnets from an Ungrafted Tree by Edna St. Vincent Millay, published in 1923. Now let's come to the next poetic form. This is dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry refers to poetic compositions in dramatic form. They are meant to be recited or acted out on stage. They can be divided into 2 types. The first is dramatic monologue. The monologue is actually a term from drama which refers to a long speech by a single character. In poetry, the dramatic monologue is a speech by one character who is also called a persona, who is speaking at a dramatic moment to a single or multiple listeners who remain silent. The dramatic monologue often aims at revealing the psychological temperament of the speaking persona through their own words. Robert Browning, who was an English Victorian poet, perfected this form of poetry. Some of his famous dramatic monologues are My Last Duchess, Fra Lippo Lippi, Andrea del Sate, etc. T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is also a dramatic monologue. Let's come to the next form, which is dramatic lyric. The dramatic lyric is also composed as a monologue, but it is more subjective in character. The speaking subject and the author's voice are often indistinguishable, and it does not make a psychological exploration of the speaker. John Donne's The Flea and Canonization are two examples of the dramatic lyric. Now let's discuss prose poetry. Prose poems are compact rhythmic compositions which are marked by cadence and extensive use of figurative language and imagery. It is actually a form of prose which is just enriched with the rhythm and imagery of poetry and is written as a continuous block without line breaks. The prose poem Bath by Amy Lowell is an example. Please note the use of alliteration, rhyme, and several other lyrical devices in the prose. This is how it goes. The day is fresh washed and fair, and there is a smell of tulips and narcissus in the air. The sunshine pours in at the bathroom window and bores through the water in the bathtub in lats and plains of greenish white. It cleaves the water into flaws like a jewel and cracks it to bright light. Little spots of sunshine lie on the surface of the water and dance, and the reflections wobble deliciously over the ceiling. A stir of my finger sets them whirring, reeling. I move a foot, and the planes of light in the water jar. I lie back and laugh, and let the green-white water, the sun-flawed beryl water, flow over me. Day is almost too bright to bear. The green water covers me from the too bright day. I will lie here a while and play with the water and the sunspots. The sky is blue and high. A crow flaps by the window, and there is a whiff of tulips and narcissus in the air. Finally, we shall discuss regional poetry and poetry in translation. The rich treasure of poems written in various languages of the world can be made available to readers unfamiliar in the language through translations. The following poem by Navakanta Borua and translated by Pradip Acharya addresses the Palestinian question metaphorically, and in its 7 lines gives us the past, the present, and the future of the problem. This is how the poem goes. We housed them in prisons, for they wanted a home. We killed them, for they wanted eternal life, then bulldozed their prisons into fields of corn. What's that hand sticking out from the earth? Other hands will sprout from it and tickle us to death. A translation alters the original because a poem has to be a poem in the target language, that is the language which it is translated into. The translation is free because the original is only an earlier version in an alien language. There have been numerous instances where translations have not only made the translated poet famous, but have also improved upon the original. Baudelaire's translation of Edgar Allan Poe, for example, is a case in point. A still burgeoning discipline called translation studies endeavors to analyze the politics involved in the act of translation. Thank you, students.